The day Caleb Weston turned 18, the sky hung low and gray over upstate New York, like a wet wool blanket pressed against the earth. March had come in mean that year, the kind of cold that didn't howl or rage, but simply seeped into everything, patient and relentless. The last patches of snow along the curves had turned to brown slush, and the air smelled of mud and diesel and endings. He stood on the cracked concrete steps of Northwood Group Home, a brick building that had once been a textile factory, then a warehouse, then a place where the state put children nobody wanted to claim. For 6 years, those walls had been his world. Not a home, never that. Just a holding pattern, a waiting room for a life that hadn't started yet. Now it was over. The door behind him clicked shut. Not a slam, just a small final sound. Like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. In his hands, Caleb held two things. The first was a black trash bag containing everything he owned in the world. 2 pairs of jeans, 4 t-shirts, all of them too thin for this weather. A worn paperback copy of his mother's favorite book, the spine cracked and soft from years of handling. And a photograph in a cheap plastic frame, the four of them at a county fair squinting into summer sunlight that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. The second thing was a manila envelope, the paper already going soft in the freezing mist. Mrs. Gable had handed him both items 15 minutes ago. She was his caseworker, a woman who had processed so many aging-out cases that her voice had worn smooth, all the edges filed down to nothing. Happy birthday, Caleb. Your final disbursement is inside, $250. And this is from the county probate office, something your grandfather left you. She had said it the way someone might announce the weather. Partly cloudy, chance of rain. Your childhood is over now. Caleb hadn't seen his grandfather since he was 9 years old. Silas Weston had died a year before the accident that took his parents, which always felt like the universe had gotten the order of tragedies wrong. Silas should have been there to catch him and his sister when they fell. Instead, he was already gone, and the fall had no bottom. The envelope was thin. Whatever his grandfather had left him, it wasn't going to change anything. Probably some old photographs. Maybe a pocket knife. Something sentimental and useless. But Caleb didn't open it. Not yet. Because there was something he needed to do first. He turned and looked back at the building. The common room window was reinforced with wire mesh, the glass cloudy with age. Behind it, pressed up against the pane, was a face. Small, pale, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that was already coming loose because Emmy never could get her hair ties tight enough. His sister was 12 years old. She had one hand pressed flat against the glass, her palm white where it touched the cold surface. Her eyes were too big for her face the way they always got when she was trying not to cry. She had gotten good at that over the years. They both had. The rules were clear. No prolonged emotional displays during transitions. It was disruptive to the other residents. It created attachment issues. It made things harder for everyone. So they couldn't say goodbye. They couldn't hug. They couldn't make promises they weren't supposed to keep. They could only look at each other through the glass. Caleb raised his own hand and pressed it against the air, an invisible pain between them, even though he was standing outside. He held it there for a long moment, his chest so tight he could feel his heartbeat in his throat. Emmy's lips moved. He couldn't hear her through the window, but he knew what she was saying. Come back for me. He nodded once. Just once. A promise made in silence. Then he turned and walked away. Because if he stood there any longer, he would walk back up those steps and pound on that door and do something that would get him arrested and would help no one. The cold bit through his thin jacket. His sneakers were worn through at the soles, and he could feel the wet seeping up from the slush with every step. The bus station was 10 blocks away. He had walked it twice before during approved outings memorizing the route. You learned to memorize escape routes when you grew up in the system. You learned to always know where the exits were, even when you had nowhere to go. $250. That was his inheritance from the state of New York. 18 years of childhood, 6 years in their care, and this was the severance package. It was enough to buy a week in a motel room that rented by the hour. It was enough to starve slowly instead of quickly. It was enough to prove that the system had technically done its job. The bus station was a low brick building that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a pale greenish glow. A few other travelers sat on the hard plastic benches, their faces blank with the particular exhaustion of people going nowhere in particular. Caleb found a seat in the corner, away from the others. He set his trash bag on the floor between his feet and finally opened the manila envelope. Inside was a single sheet of legal paper dense with small print. The letterhead read, Harlan Finch, Attorney at Law, with an address in a town Caleb had never heard of somewhere deep in the Catskill Mountains. He had to read the letter 3 times before the words started making sense. His grandfather had left him something in his will. Not money, not photographs, land. Specifically a 2.5-acre parcel of unincorporated property in the mountains. The letter called it Lot 7B. There was no road access, no utilities, no well or septic system, just raw land with a single structure on it, described in the documents as a surplus military shelter condition unknown. To claim the deed, Caleb would need to appear in person at Mr. Finch's office and pay the outstanding property taxes and transfer fees. The total amount due was $5. Caleb stared at that number for a long time. $5. He could buy a sandwich for $5. A cup of coffee and a day-old donut. A single ride on a bus going somewhere else. $5 for 2.5 acres of land. There had to be a catch. Land didn't cost $5. Nothing worth having cost $5. This was either a mistake or a joke or some kind of trap he couldn't see yet. But attached to the letter was a grainy photocopy of a satellite image. The resolution was poor, the blacks and grays all bleeding into each other, but he could make out the shape of the property. A rough square of land surrounded by dense forest. And in the center, a long curved structure that looked like a metal bread loaf dropped in the middle of nowhere. A Quonset hut. He recognized the shape from history books. Those corrugated steel half-cylinders that the military had used for everything from barracks to storage. After the wars, they had been sold off cheap, scattered across rural America, to serve as barns and workshops and shelters for people who couldn't afford anything better. This one looked abandoned. Even in the blurry photograph, he could see how the forest was creeping in around it, the trees pressing close like they were trying to take it back. A piece of junk on a piece of worthless land. That's why it cost $5. It was a liability, not an asset. Probably contaminated. Probably falling apart. Probably more trouble than it was worth. His first instinct was to throw the letter away, crumple it up and toss it in the trash can by the vending machines. He needed to focus on survival. He needed to find a job, find a room, start saving money so that in 6 years when Emmy aged out of the system, she wouldn't be standing on those same steps with nothing but a trash bag and a useless promise. 6 years. That was how long he had to build something from nothing. The bus schedule on the wall showed a departure in 40 minutes. South toward the city, toward the shelters and the day labor offices and the anonymous grind that everyone said was waiting for kids like him. He had heard the statistics. 60% of aged-out foster youth experienced homelessness within 4 years. The odds were not in his favor, but the letter wouldn't leave his mind. $5. It was the price of a cup of coffee, the price of giving up before he even started. Caleb pulled the photograph out of his trash bag, the one from the county fair, his mother and father young and sunburned and happy in a way that felt impossible now. Little Emmy on his father's shoulders, her face sticky with cotton candy. And in the background, slightly out of focus, a tall man with silver hair and work-rough hands. Silas Weston. His grandfather had been a quiet man, not cold, just economical with words. He worked with his hands his whole life, first as a stonemason, then as a carpenter. He smelled of sawdust and pipe tobacco. He had taught Caleb how to tie a proper knot, how to read a compass, how to tell if wood was dry enough to burn. He had not been a man who played jokes. He had not been a man who did things without reason. So why this? Why leave his grandson a worthless piece of land in the mountains? Why make him come claim it for $5 instead of just giving it to him outright? Caleb looked up at the departure board. The bus to the city was boarding now. Gate 3, last call. But there was another bus on the board, a different route heading north and west into the mountains. One of its stops was a town he recognized from the lawyer's letterhead. He had a choice. The first real choice he had been allowed to make in 6 years. He could go south toward the expected future. The shelters, the struggle, the slow grinding down of hope. Or he could go north toward a mystery, a piece of land that cost less than lunch, a rusted metal hut in the middle of the woods. Caleb stood up. His legs felt unsteady, like the floor was tilting beneath him. He walked to the ticket counter, the trash bag slung over his shoulder. "One ticket to Millbrook Station," he said. The woman behind the counter didn't look up. $22. He peeled the bills from his envelope. $228 remaining. Not enough to build a life, but maybe enough to find out why his grandfather had left him this particular puzzle. The bus pulled out of the station at 11 in the morning. Caleb sat by the window, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching the city fall away behind him. The landscape changed slowly at first, then all at once. The strip malls and parking lots gave way to bare trees and brown fields. The hills grew steeper. The sky seemed to drop lower, pressing down on the winding road. Snow still clung to the shadows here, stubborn white patches that refused to surrender to spring. The other passengers were mostly older, their faces weathered by years of hard work and harder winters. No one spoke to him. No one asked where he was going or why. In small towns like these, people knew how to mind their own business. They knew that sometimes a young man on a bus had reasons he didn't want to share. Caleb was grateful for the silence. It gave him time to think. But mostly he thought about Emmy, about her hand pressed against the glass, about the way her lips had moved, forming words he could only see, not hear. Come back for me. He would, somehow. He didn't know how yet, but he would. The bus made stops in towns that barely qualified as towns, a gas station with a general store attached, a cluster of houses around a church with a white steeple, places where time moved differently, where the seasons mattered more than the calendar. By mid-afternoon, they reached Millbrook Station. It wasn't really a station, just a covered bench beside the road where the bus driver let him off. The town itself was a quarter-mile up a steep hill, a collection of brick buildings and wooden storefronts that looked like they had been there for 100 years and planned to stay 100 more. The lawyer's office was on Main Street, sandwiched between a hardware store and a barbershop. The sign in the window was hand-painted, the gold letters faded by decades of sun. Harlan Finch, attorney at law, established 1962. Caleb pushed open the door. A small bell chimed overhead. The office smelled of old paper and furniture polish and something else, something that might have been pipe tobacco or might have been memory. The walls were lined with bookshelves, every shelf packed tight with leather-bound volumes that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Behind a heavy mahogany desk sat a man who seemed to have grown out of the furniture. He was old, somewhere past 70, but still sharp around the eyes. He had a neat white beard and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. When he looked up, his gaze was steady and measuring, the kind of look that saw more than it let on. "Mr. Weston," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. I wondered if you would come." He gestured to a chair across from the desk. "Please, sit." Caleb sat. The chair was old leather, cracked but comfortable. He set his trash bag on the floor, suddenly aware of how out of place it looked in this room full of antiques and history. Mr. Finch studied him for a long moment. "You look like him, you know. Your grandfather. Same jaw, same eyes." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "He was my client for 30 years, Mr. Finch continued. "A good man. Quiet but good." He paused. "He made me promise to give you something when you turned 18. Made me promise to wait until exactly this day, no sooner." The lawyer opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a thick manila folder. He set it on the desk between them. "This is the deed to parcel 7B, 2.5 acres of unincorporated land in the hills about 12 miles from here. No road access, no utilities. There's a structure on it, but I can't speak to its condition. No one has been out there in years." Caleb swallowed. The letter said $5. "That's correct. Outstanding property taxes and transfer fees. Your grandfather paid the rest in advance years ago. He wanted to make sure the price was something you could afford." He smiled slightly. He was very specific about that. Why Mr. Finch's expression shifted, something moving behind his eyes that might have been admiration or might have been sorrow. "He never told me his reasons. Your grandfather was a private man, Mr. Weston. He didn't explain himself. He just made preparations." He leaned forward. "But I can tell you this. Last week I received an inquiry about the property. A developer, part of a larger LLC that's been buying up land in this area." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. What did they want? They wanted to buy it. They offered $5,000, as is no questions asked. $5,000. The number hit Caleb like a physical blow. $5,000 was more money than he had ever seen. It was a security deposit on an apartment. It was 6 months of breathing room. It was a chance. Finch was watching him carefully. 5,000 is their opening offer, he said, which means they'd go higher if pressed. They've been very persistent. His emphasis on the word made it sound like a warning. They're planning some kind of development in this area, a resort, I believe. They've been buying up every parcel they can get. Caleb stared at the folder on the desk. Inside was the deed to his grandfather's land, the land that had been waiting for him, and the land that cost $5. 5,000 would change everything. He could get a place to live. He could start saving for Emmy. He could, but something stopped him. His grandfather had made this happen, had planned it for years, had paid the taxes in advance, had specified that Caleb receive it on his 18th birthday, not before. There had to be a reason. "I'm not selling," Caleb said. The words came out before he had fully decided to say them. But once they were spoken, they felt right. They felt like the first solid ground he had stood on in years. Mr. Finch's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. A small spark of what might have been approval. "Very well." He slid a pen across the desk. "Sign here and here." Caleb signed. His handwriting looked shaky like a child's scrawl, but it was his name, his decision, his. Mr. Finch stamped the documents and slid something else across the desk. A key, large, iron, old-fashioned, the kind of key that belonged to another century. It was covered in a fine layer of rust, but the metal beneath was solid. "This is for the padlock on the hut. Your grandfather left it with me years ago along with this." He handed Caleb a piece of yellowed paper. A hand-drawn map, the lines precise and careful. The kind of map made by someone who knew how to work with his hands. "Follow County Road 9 for 3 miles, Mr. Finch said. "You'll see a turnoff for Old Miller Road. It's not much of a road anymore, more of a track. Follow it until it ends, then walk. The property is about half a mile through the woods from there." He stood and extended his hand. Caleb shook it. The old man's grip was surprisingly strong. "Good luck, Mr. Weston." He paused. "I have a feeling you are going to need it." The walk was longer than Caleb expected. County Road 9 was paved, but barely. The asphalt was cracked and heaved from years of frost, and the shoulders dropped off into muddy ditches. No cars passed him. The only sounds were his own footsteps and the distant calling of crows. After 3 miles, he found the turnoff. A wooden post that might once have had a sign on it, though whatever words had been there were long gone. The road beyond was not really a road at all. 2 muddy ruts disappearing into a thicket of pine and bare-limbed maple. The afternoon was fading. The sun hung low and orange through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The temperature was dropping. Caleb could see his breath, now small white clouds that hung in the air before dissolving. He should turn back, find a motel in town. Come back in the morning when he could see where he was going. But something pulled him forward. Some stubbornness he didn't know he had, or maybe something his grandfather had put there years ago in those summers, when Caleb was small and the world still made sense. "You finish what you start, boy." That's what Silas used to say. Doesn't matter if it's hard. Doesn't matter if you're tired. You finish what you start. Caleb kept walking. The track grew narrower, the ruts shallower, until finally it disappeared altogether into a tangle of brush and fallen branches. According to the map, the property was another half-mile north. He pushed through the undergrowth, following the compass in his head. The light was almost gone now, the sky turning from orange to purple to deep blue. The trees pressed close, their bare branches reaching toward each other overhead, like the bones of some enormous animal. And then suddenly the forest opened. He stood at the edge of a small clearing. The ground was rough and uneven, covered with dead leaves and the brown stalks of last year's weeds. And in the center of the clearing, hunched against the darkening sky, was the Quonset hut. It was bigger than he had expected. Maybe 50 feet long and half as wide, the curved metal roof rising 15 feet at its peak. But size was where the impressiveness ended. The corrugated steel was covered in rust, great blooming patches of orange and brown that spread across the surface like a disease. The 2 large doors at the front were dented and bent, hanging slightly off their tracks. Weeds and small saplings grew right up to the walls, nature slowly reclaiming what had been abandoned. It looked like something that had been forgotten by the world. Caleb walked around it slowly, taking in the damage. Small windows high up on the sides, too grimy to see through. A stovepipe poking crookedly from the back, black with old soot. The ground around the foundation was soft and spongy, saturated with snowmelt and years of neglect. This was his inheritance. This was what his grandfather had saved for him. A rusted metal box in the middle of nowhere. The $5,000 echoed in his mind again. He could still go back. He could call the lawyer in the morning, tell him he had changed his mind. Take the money and run. But his hand found the key in his pocket. The iron was cold against his fingers. Heavy. Real. He walked to the front doors. A thick chain was wrapped through the handles, held together by a padlock that looked as old as the building itself. The rust had spread here too, the metal fused by years of moisture and neglect. Caleb slid the key into the lock. It didn't want to turn. The mechanism was seized, the rust binding the parts together. He put his shoulder into it, gripping the key with both hands, twisting with everything he had. For a moment, nothing. Then a screech of metal on metal, a grinding protest that echoed through the silent woods. And then a solid, satisfying clunk. The lock sprang open, the chain fell away and hit the ground with a heavy clatter. Caleb grabbed the edge of the door and pulled. It groaned on its tracks, the sound like something waking from a long sleep. Rust flaked off in orange showers. The hinges screamed. But inch by inch, the door slid open. Inside, the darkness was absolute. The air that rolled out was thick and musty, carrying the smell of old earth and rust and years of stillness. Caleb could see nothing beyond the threshold, just a wall of black. But then his eyes adjusted, and he saw. The interior was one vast open space, the curved ceiling arching overhead like the rib cage of some enormous beast. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven, covered in a fine layer of dust. Old leaves had blown in through gaps in the walls, collecting in drifts against the corners. It was empty, completely empty, except for one thing. In the center of the space, directly beneath a crack in the roof where a single beam of fading daylight slanted down, was a wooden crate. It sat there like it was waiting, like it had been placed there, deliberately positioned to catch the only light in the building. Caleb's heart was pounding now. He could feel it in his throat, in his temples, in the tips of his fingers. He crossed the space slowly, his footsteps echoing off the metal walls. The crate was old, made of dark weathered wood, with rope handles on the sides. There was no lid, just an open box sitting in a shaft of dying light. He looked inside. At first, his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. Glass jars, dozens of them packed in straw, each one sealed with a wax lid. The kind of jars people use for canning, for preserving fruits and vegetables. But these jars weren't filled with food. They were filled with money. Caleb reached in and lifted one of the jars. It was heavier than he expected. Through the glass, he could see tightly rolled bundles of bills, held together with rubber bands that had dried and cracked with age. He set the jar down and picked up another. The same, and another, and another. Every jar was packed with cash. Old bills, soft with age but real. $20 bills, 50s, hundreds. Caleb sank to his knees on the cold concrete floor. His legs wouldn't hold him anymore. His hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped the jar he was holding. He pulled out one of the bundles. The rubber band crumbled to dust when he touched it, and the bills fanned out across his lap. He counted them with trembling fingers. $1,000. In that one bundle alone. There were dozens of bundles in each jar, and there were dozens of jars in the crate. This wasn't $5,000. This wasn't even $50,000. This was more money than Caleb had ever imagined existing in one place. A sound escaped him. Something between a laugh and a soem. It echoed off the metal walls and came back to him strange and broken. All those years in the system, all those nights lying awake wondering how he was going to survive. All that fear and hunger and hopelessness. And here, waiting in the dark, his grandfather had left him this. But as the shock began to fade, Caleb noticed something else. At the bottom of the crate, tucked beneath the last layer of straw, was something that wasn't money. A book. Leather-bound, thick with age. The cover was worn smooth by years of handling, and embossed in faded gold letters was a name. Silas Weston, his grandfather's journal. Caleb lifted it carefully as if it might crumble at his touch. The leather was soft and warm, holding the memory of hands that had held it before. He opened it to the first page, but it wasn't a journal entry. It was a letter. The handwriting was neat and precise, the kind of penmanship they didn't teach anymore. The script of a man who worked with his hands and took pride in everything he did, and it was addressed to him. Dear Caleb, if you are reading this, it means you turned 18. It means you survived. It means you were strong enough to make it this far, and it means you didn't take the easy money from those developers. I knew you wouldn't. You have your mother's heart, but you have my stubbornness. That's a good combination for the road ahead. This place probably doesn't look like Ma, and the money in that crate is for you and your sister, every penny. It's everything I saved over my whole life. I sold the house after your grandmother passed. I lived cheap. I wanted you both to have a foundation, something the world couldn't take away. But here's the important thing, boy. The money is the least valuable thing I'm leaving you. The most important thing is underneath. Do you remember what I taught you about building a house is only as good as its foundation? Get that right and everything else follows. Get it wrong and nothing you build on top will ever stand. This hut, this land, this is your foundation. Not the money, not the walls. What's beneath them? They'll come for it. The developers, the men in suits, they'll offer you more than you've ever seen. They'll make it seem like the smart choice, the easy choice. Don't listen. You own something they need, something they can't get anywhere else. And as long as you hold on to it, you hold the cards. Find what I left you. It's all there in the foundation. And when you figured it out, when you understand what you really have, then you'll know what to do. I believe in you, boy. I always have. Build something good. Your grandfather, Silas Caleb, read the letter 3 times. Then he read it again. The foundation. He looked at the concrete floor beneath him. Cracked, uneven, ordinary. But his grandfather had been a stonemason, a man who knew how to build things that lasted, a man who knew how to hide things in plain sight. There was something here, something beneath the surface. Caleb stood up, his legs still unsteady. The light from the crack in the roof was almost gone now, the last rays of sunset fading into twilight. Soon it would be dark, and he had no flashlight, no supplies, no plan. But he had the letter, he had the money, he had a roof over his head, however rusted and broken, and he had his grandfather's final challenge. Find what I left you. It's all there in the foundation. Caleb looked around at the vast empty space, at the curved metal walls and the cracked concrete floor and the crate full of money that could change his life. Then he looked at the photograph still clutched in his hand, the one from the county fair, his mother and father, little Emmy on her father's shoulders. And in the background, slightly out of focus, a tall man with silver hair and work-rough hands. A man who had been planning this moment for years. A man who had built a fortress in the wilderness for a grandson he knew would need one. Come back for me, Emmy's silent words, her hand pressed against the glass. I will, Caleb whispered to the empty hut, to the darkness, to the ghost of the man who had left him this impossible gift. I promise. Outside, the last light faded from the sky. The forest went dark and quiet. And somewhere in the mountains, a young man sat in a rusted metal shelter, surrounded by more money than he had ever seen, holding a letter from a dead man and a promise he didn't know how to keep. But he would learn, because that's what his grandfather had taught him. You finish what you start. Doesn't matter if it's hard. Doesn't matter if you're tired. You finish what you start. The first night was the longest of Caleb's life. He didn't sleep, not really. The cold was too deep, too persistent, creeping up through the cracked concrete floor and seeping down from the metal ceiling until his whole body felt like it had been carved from ice. He had found a pile of old canvas tarps in a corner, stiff with age and smelling of mildew, and wrapped himself in them like a cocoon. But the cold found its way through every gap, every fold. The darkness was absolute. No street lights, no distant glow of a city on the horizon. Just blackness, so thick it felt solid, pressing against his eyes like a physical weight. The only sounds were the wind outside rattling the metal walls and the occasional creak of the old structure settling on its foundation. He lay there in the dark, shivering, listening to his own heartbeat. The money was still in the crate. He had counted enough to know it was real, to know it was more than he could comprehend. But he hadn't touched it since reading his grandfather's letter. It felt dangerous somehow. Too much too fast. A secret that could burn everything down if he wasn't careful. Instead, he thought about the letter, about the foundation, about what his grandfather had hidden beneath this rusted shell. They'll come for it, the developers, the men in suits. Mr. Finch had said the same thing, a company buying up land, a resort, persistent inquiries. $5,000 had seemed like a fortune this morning. Now Caleb understood it was an insult. They knew something, they wanted something, and they thought he was just another disposable kid who would take the easy money and disappear. They were wrong. When the first gray light of dawn crept through the crack in the roof, Caleb was already awake. His body ached from the cold and the hard floor. His fingers were stiff, his breath still fogged in the frigid air. But he was alive. He had made it through the night, and now he had work to do. The first priority was survival. Water, warmth, food. Everything else could wait. He spent the morning exploring the property in daylight. The land was rough and overgrown, but he could see the bones of something deliberate beneath the neglect. A clearing that had once been larger. The remnants of an old fence line, the posts rotted to stumps. A path worn into the earth that led away from the hut toward the east. He followed the path and found what he was looking for. A stream maybe 20 feet wide, running fast and clear over a bed of smooth stones. The water was cold enough to make his teeth ache when he cupped it in his hands and drank, but it was clean. It tasted like snowmelt and pine needles in survival. He spent an hour hauling water back to the hut in an old bucket he found behind the building, the handle rusted but still solid. 6 trips, enough to fill every container he could find, enough to know he wouldn't die of thirst. Next was warmth. The wood stove in the back of the hut was ancient, a cast iron beast covered in years of dust and cobwebs. The stovepipe was crooked, the joints loose, the whole assembly looking like it might collapse if he breathed on it wrong. But when Caleb got down on his knees and looked inside, he found the firebox was intact. No cracks, no holes, just surface rust and neglect. His grandfather had been a careful man. He wouldn't have left a faulty stove. Caleb spent the rest of the morning cleaning it. He found a wire brush in a toolbox beneath the tarp pile, the bristles stiff with age but still functional. He scrubbed the rust from the firebox, tightened the joints on the stovepipe, swept out years of accumulated ash and debris. Then he went outside and found deadfall. Branches brought down by winter storms, dry and brittle and perfect for burning. He dragged them back to the hut, broke them into manageable pieces with his hands and feet, and built a fire in the belly of the old stove. The match was from a pack he had found in the toolbox. The sulfur tips faded, but still viable. He struck it against the rough metal of the stove once, twice, 3 times. The flame caught. He fed it carefully, nursing the small fire with dry leaves and twigs until it grew strong enough to accept larger pieces. The wood crackled and popped. Smoke rose through the crooked pipe, and slowly and possibly, the vast metal cavern of the Quonset hut began to warm. Caleb sat beside the stove with his hands extended toward the heat, feeling the blood return to his fingers, feeling the ice in his bones begin to thaw. This was the first thing he had built here, the first victory. There would be more. The town was a 3-hour walk each way. Caleb made the trip that afternoon, arriving at the hardware store just as the sun began its descent toward the western ridge. The store was called Brewer's Supply, the name painted on a wooden sign that hung crooked above the door. Inside, it smelled of metal and oil and the particular mustiness of a place that had been selling the same inventory for 50 years. The man behind the counter matched the store. He was somewhere past 60 with a weathered face and hands that had done real work. His hair was gray and thin, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. He wore a flannel shirt and suspenders, and he looked at Caleb the way you might look at a stray dog that had wandered in from the cold. "Help you." His voice was gravel and smoke. Caleb had made a list during the walk. He pulled it from his pocket, the paper already soft from handling. "I need an axe, a bow saw, tarps for patching a roof, a camp stove, a sleeping bag, buckets, rope." The old man didn't move, just kept looking at Caleb with those sharp eyes. "That's a lot of gear for someone walking in from nowhere." Caleb met his gaze. "I'm fixing up a place, out on the old Miller Road." Something shifted in the man's expression. A flicker of recognition quickly suppressed. The Weston place, it wasn't a question. Caleb nodded. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed himself up from his stool and came around the counter. "Name's Gus Brewer. This is my store." He didn't offer to shake hands, and Caleb didn't ask. They moved through the aisles together, Gus pulling items from shelves and in hooks with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly where everything was. An axe with a hickory handle, the head sharp and oiled, a bow saw with new teeth, a heavy canvas tarp, a propane camp stove in a battered cardboard box, a sleeping bag rated for 20 below. Caleb watched the prices add up in his head. He had taken $300 from the crate, carefully selected bills that didn't look too old or too new. But even that might not be enough. When they reached the register, Gus tallied the items on an old mechanical cash register, the keys clacking with each entry. $247. Caleb pulled out the bills. His hands were steady, but his chest was tight. This was almost everything he had brought with him. But Gus held up a hand. "I knew your grandfather." The words hung in the air between them. He used to come in here back when he was working on that place. Never talked much, just bought what he needed and went on his way. Gus paused, his eyes distant with memory. He was a good man, built things right, built things to last. Caleb didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. 200 even, Gus said finally. "Consider the rest a welcome to the neighborhood discount." Caleb nodded once. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Gus handed him the receipt. "Just don't make me regret it." Caleb carried the supplies back to the hut in 2 trips, making the second journey in darkness, with only the moon and his memory of the path to guide him. By the time he finished, his legs were shaking with exhaustion and his shoulders ached from the weight. But the hut was warm when he returned. The fire had held. The sleeping bag was thick and soft against his skin. He slept better that second night. Not well, but better. And when he woke, he got back to work. The days blurred together after that. Each one was a battle against the decay that had claimed the hut, each victory small but tangible. He patched the hole in the roof with the tarp, climbing the curved metal surface with a rope tied around his waist, his heart pounding every time his feet slipped on the frost-slicked steel. The patch wasn't pretty, but it held. The leak stopped. He cleared the brush from around the building, chopping through saplings and thorn bushes with the axe until his hands were raw and bleeding beneath his work gloves. Blisters formed, broke, hardened into calluses. His shoulders learned new shapes, new strengths. He hauled water from the stream every day, 6 buckets each trip, until his arms knew the weight as intimately as they knew his own heartbeat. He chopped wood until the pile beside the hut grew taller than his head, enough to last through the coldest nights. The work was brutal and lonely and endless. It was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Because for the first time in his life, Caleb was building something. Not following someone else's rules, not waiting for someone else's permission, building. And at night, when the work was done and the fire crackled in the old stove, he would sit with his grandfather's journal and read. The entries spanned decades. Silas had started the journal when he was a young man, just back from his service working on dam projects throughout the state. The early pages were technical, full of notes about rock formations and water tables and the mathematics of construction. But as the years went on, the entries became more personal. There were passages about Caleb's grandmother, about the house they built together, about the joy and sorrow of a long life. And there were passages about Caleb himself. The boy has good hands, steady, patient. He doesn't rush. Most kids his age can't sit still long enough to learn anything, but Caleb watches. He listens. He understands that some things take time. Caleb remembered the summer his grandfather had written about. He had been 9 years old, spending 2 months on the farm while his parents worked. Silas had taught him how to split wood, how to read the grain, how to swing an axe so that the weight did the work instead of your muscles. A man is measured by what he builds, not by what he says. That's what Silas used to tell him. Anyone can talk, anyone can make promises, but building something that lasts, something real, that's rare, that's worth something. Caleb had forgotten those words. Years in the system had ground them out of him, replacing them with the hard arithmetic of survival. But now, alone in the wilderness with an axe in his hand and his grandfather's voice in his ears, he remembered. And he kept building. 3 weeks after arriving at the hut, Caleb made his first call to Emmy. He walked to town in the early morning, the frost still thick on the ground. There was a payphone outside the general store, an ancient relic that somehow still worked. He had memorized the number for the phone in the hallway near Emmy's room at Northwood. She would be waiting. She always waited. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Caleb. Her voice was small, thin, with distance and fear. It's me, May. The nickname slipped out before he could stop it. Their mother had called her that. May for Emmy because when she was born in May, and their father had wanted to name her after the month, but their mother had insisted on something more traditional. So Emmy, it was but May for short. Where are you? Are you okay? They won't tell me anything. They just say you aged out, but I know there's more. I know, hey. Caleb kept his voice steady, calm. I'm okay. I'm good, actually. Better than good. She was quiet for a moment, processing. You found the place, I found it. He couldn't help the smile that crept into his voice. It's real, Emmy. It's a real place. I've got a roof over my head and a stove for heat and more land than I can even see from one end to the other. Is it nice? Caleb laughed. The sound surprised him. He hadn't laughed in months. No, it's a disaster. The roof leaks, the walls are rusted, and there's no electricity or running water. It's the worst place I've ever seen. Oh, her voice fell. But I'm fixing it. Every day I'm fixing it. And when it's done, Emmy, when I've got it right, he had to stop, his throat suddenly tight. I'm going to come get you. I'm going to bring you home. Silence on the line. Then very quietly, promise, I promise. He could hear her breathing, could picture her standing in that dim hallway with the phone pressed to her ear, her two big eyes full of something that might have been hope. I believe you, she said finally. I'll wait. I know you will. Caleb. Yeah, build it strong. Okay, build it strong enough for both of us. I will, Emmy. I will. He hung up the phone and stood there for a long moment, the cold wind cutting through his jacket. The weight of that promise settled on his shoulders heavier than any load he had carried. 6 years. That's how long until she aged out. 6 years to build something worth coming home to. He started walking back toward the hut. The car appeared on a Tuesday. Caleb was on the roof securing a new section of patching over a weak spot he had found near the back. He heard the engine before he saw it, a low purr that didn't belong to these woods, these rutted mountain roads. He climbed down and walked around to the front of the hut just as the car emerged from the tree line. It was black and sleek, the kind of vehicle that cost more than most people made in a year. The chrome gleamed even in the pale winter light. It looked wrong here, a creature from another world. The car stopped at the edge of the clearing and a man got out. He was tall and lean-dressed in a dark overcoat that probably cost as much as the car. His hair was silver at the temples, swept back from a face that was handsome in a practiced way, like he had spent years perfecting the arrangement of his features. He picked his way across the muddy ground, his expensive shoes squelching with each step. When he reached Caleb, he stopped and then looked up at the Quonset hut, his expression carefully neutral. Mr. Weston, I presume. His voice was smooth, cultured, the kind of voice that belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. But there was something underneath it, something cold. Who's asking? The man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Warren Prescott, I represent Ridgeline Development Corporation. He reached into his coat and produced a business card, offering it with a practiced flourish. We've been trying to reach you. Caleb didn't take the card. I don't have a phone, so I've discovered. Prescott tucked the card back into his pocket, unbothered. That's why I thought I'd pay you a personal visit. See the property for myself. He looked around at the clearing, at the rusted hut, at the muddy ground. Quite a project you've got here. What do you want? Prescott's smile widened slightly. Direct. I appreciate that. He clasped his hands behind his back, a gesture that managed to be both casual and threatening. I'll be equally direct. My company has been acquiring properties in this area for a development project. A resort community. Very high-end. The kind of place that will bring ease and investment to this region. Good for you. The point is, Mr. Weston, your property sits right in the middle of our planned development area. He gestured vaguely at the surrounding forest. We've already acquired most of the adjacent parcels. Your land is the final piece of the puzzle. Caleb said nothing, just waited. We'd like to make you an offer. Prescott reached into his coat again, this time producing a folded document. $25,000. Cash. As is no inspections, no contingencies. You sign today, the money hits your account by Friday. $25,000. Caleb felt the number hit him the same way $5,000 had hit him in Mr. Finch's office. But this time he was ready for it. This time he understood what it meant. They were scared. If the land was really worthless, they wouldn't be here. They wouldn't be sending a man in a $2,000 coat to negotiate with an 18-year-old kid in muddy work boots. There was something here, something valuable. And they were trying to steal it from him before he figured out what it was. No, the word hung in the cold air between them. Prescott's smile flickered. I'm sorry, I said no. This land isn't for sale. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Something moved behind Prescott's eyes, something that might have been anger quickly suppressed. I think you should reconsider. His voice was still smooth, but the warmth had drained out of it. 25,000 is a very generous offer for a piece of property like this. No utilities, no access, just a rusted hunk of metal that should have been condemned years ago. And yet here you are, Caleb said, driving 3 hours to make me an offer in person. Prescott's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This is a courtesy, Mr. Weston. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. Take the money. Start your life somewhere else. You don't want to make this difficult. Is that a threat? It's advice. Prescott stepped back, his composure returning. My company has resources, legal resources. We can make things very uncomfortable for someone in your position. And what position is that, young? Alone, no connections, no support. Prescott smiled again, but there was no pretense of friendliness now. Just teeth. We've done our research, Mr. Weston. We know about the group home. We know about your sister. He paused, letting that sink in. We know you have nothing. The mention of Emmy sent a jolt of cold rage through Caleb's chest, but he kept his face still, his voice level. Get off my land. Prescott studied him for a moment the way a predator might study prey that had suddenly shown claws. You'll regret this, he said finally. We'll be in touch. He turned and walked back to his car, moving carefully across the muddy ground. The engine purred to life. The tires spun once, twice, then found traction. Caleb watched until the car disappeared into the trees. Then he went back inside and sat down beside the wood stove, his hands shaking with a combination of anger and fear. They knew about Emmy. They were watching him, researching him, looking for leverage. But they didn't know about the money. They didn't know about the letter. They didn't know that his grandfather had been preparing for exactly this moment for 30 years. You own something they need, something they can't get anywhere else. Caleb pulled out the journal and read those words again. His grandfather had been expecting this. The developers, the pressure, the threats. He had seen it coming and had built defenses against it. Find what I left you. It's all there in the foundation. The foundation. Caleb looked at the concrete floor beneath him. He had walked across it 100 times, had cleaned it, swept it, mopped up puddles when the roof leaked. It was just concrete, cracked in places, uneven in others, but unremarkable. Except that his grandfather had been a stonemason, a man who knew how to build things, a man who knew how to hide things. Caleb got down on his hands and knees and started to search. It took him 3 days. 3 days of crawling across the floor, running his fingers along every crack and seam. 3 days of sweeping away dust and debris, looking for anything that didn't belong. 3 days of frustration, of doubting himself, of wondering if he had misunderstood the letter entirely. He found it on the morning of the 4th day. In the back corner of the hut, partially hidden by the wood stove, there was a line in the concrete. Not a crack. A line. Perfectly straight, deliberately cut. It formed a square about 4 feet on each side. A seam. Caleb's heart began to pound. He moved the wood stove aside, straining against its weight until the entire square was visible. There was no handle, no obvious way to open it. The concrete was flush, seamless, revealing nothing. But his grandfather had been a builder. He understood leverage. He understood physics. Caleb found a long piece of timber, a leftover from his roof repairs. He wedged it into the seam at one edge and pushed down. At first, nothing. The concrete didn't budge. He adjusted his grip, found a better angle, and pushed again. Harder this time. A grinding sound, the scrape of stone against stone, and then slowly and possibly, the edge of the concrete slab began to rise. It was a counterweight system, pushed down on one side and the other side lifted. Simple, elegant, and hidden in plain sight. The slab tilted up, revealing a dark square hole in the foundation. A ladder made of iron rebar descended into the blackness. Caleb grabbed his flashlight and climbed down. The space below was small, maybe 8 feet square. The walls were made of fieldstone fitted together with the precision of a master craftsman. The air was cold and dry, smelling of deep earth and old secrets. In the center of the chamber, on a stone pedestal, was a heavy metal lockbox, and beside it, sealed in a glass jar to protect it from moisture, was a letter. Caleb opened the jar with trembling fingers and unfolded the paper. Caleb, if you found this, you were paying attention. Good man. I built this hut for a reason, not just to hide the money, not just to give you a roof. I built it on this exact spot because of what's under it. When I was a young man, I worked on a geological survey team for the state. We mapped this whole region looking for resources, for weaknesses in the bedrock, for anything that might matter someday. Most of what we found was ordinary, shale and granite, good for building, not much else. But there was something else, something they didn't want people to know about. Under this ridge running for miles in every direction, there's an aquifer, a deep underground reservoir of some of the purest spring water in the entire state. The survey was buried classified by people who wanted to control the information. I was just a worker. I wasn't supposed to remember. But I remembered. This land, your land, sits directly on top of the main reservoir. The water rights for this parcel were never separated from the deed because nobody knew the water was there. You don't just own 2.5 acres of dirt, son. You own the water underneath it, all of it. Caleb read the letter 3 times, his mind struggling to absorb what it meant. Water. The developers weren't trying to build a resort on worthless land. They were trying to build a resort that needed water. Massive amounts of water. Golf courses, swimming pools, hotels, landscaping. And the only source for miles around was directly beneath his feet. That's why they were so persistent. That's why they were willing to pay $25,000 for a rusted hut on land with no utilities. They needed what he had, and they couldn't get it anywhere else. Caleb opened the lockbox. Inside, carefully organized and preserved, were documents. Geological surveys with official stamps. Water table measurements. Maps marked with the location of the aquifer. And a legal opinion dated 15 years ago from a water rights specialist. The owner of Parcel 7B controls access to the Millbrook Aquifer. Any commercial extraction of groundwater in this region would require either the purchase of the property or a negotiated agreement with the landowner. His grandfather had been planning this for decades, finding the land, buying it cheap, paying the taxes, documenting everything, building the hut directly over the access point, all of it waiting for Caleb, waiting for this moment. A week later, Prescott came back. This time he didn't come alone. A second car followed his, this one carrying 2 men in suits who looked like lawyers. They set up a table in the clearing, spread documents across it, and waited while Prescott approached the hut. "Mr. Weston?" His tone was different now, harder. "We need to talk." Caleb stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been installing a new window frame, one he had built himself from salvaged lumber. "Talk." Prescott smiled thinly. "We filed a petition with the county. Your structure doesn't meet code. It's a blight on the landscape." He gestured at the rusted walls. "Under eminent domain provisions, the county can seize the property for public use. The county hasn't shown any interest in this land for 30 years. Things change." Prescott's smile widened. "New developments bring new priorities. We've been very generous with the county commissioners. I'm sure they'll see reason." Caleb felt the fear rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. His grandfather's letters were burned into his memory now. Every word, every warning. "You're bluffing." Prescott's expression flickered. "Excuse me, you don't want this to go to court. Because if it goes to court, there'll be discovery. Documents. Surveys." He paused, watching Prescott's face carefully. "Records." The developer's smile faltered for just a moment. "Not long, but long enough. I don't know what you think you found. I know exactly what I found." Caleb kept his voice level steady. "I know why you want this land, and it's not for a resort." Silence stretched between them. The lawyers at the table had stopped shuffling papers. Everyone was watching. Prescott's mask slipped back into place, but something had changed behind his eyes. Calculation. Reassessment. "What do you want?" "Nothing you're willing to give." Caleb turned and walked back toward the hut. "So get off my property, and don't come back without a warrant." He didn't look back, didn't wait to see them leave. Just went inside and sat down beside the stove, his hands trembling. He had called their bluff, for now. But they would be back, with lawyers, with paperwork, with whatever weapons they could find. He needed to be ready. That night, Caleb read his grandfather's second letter. He had found it in the lockbox beneath the surveys and legal documents. A separate envelope, sealed with wax, his name written on the front in Silas's careful hand. Caleb. By now you've met them. The developers, the men in suits, the ones who think they can take whatever they want because they have money and lawyers and connections. They're not evil, most of them, just greedy. They see an opportunity and they take it. That's how they're built. But you're built different. I knew it when you were 9 years old sitting on my porch watching me work. Most boys would have gotten bored, would have wandered off to play, but you sat there for hours watching my hands learning the patterns. You understood that some things are worth waiting for. Don't let them bully you, son. They'll try. They'll offer you money that sounds like a kingdom. They'll threaten you with lawyers and lawsuits and words you don't understand. But you have what they need, not the other way around. Remember that. And remember what I taught you about building. A foundation isn't just concrete and stone. It's patience, it's planning. It's understanding that the work you do today is for a future you can't even see yet. You're building that future now. For yourself, for your sister. Make it strong enough to hold you both. I believe in you. Always have. Silas Caleb folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. Through the small window he had installed that morning, he could see the stars emerging one by one in the darkening sky. The same stars his grandfather had watched from this same spot decades ago. The fire crackled in the stove. The walls, for all their rust and age, held steady against the wind. He had survived the first assault, but the war was just beginning. Tomorrow he would go to the library in town. He would learn about water rights. He would learn about easements and surveys and all the legal weapons his enemies might use. And he would prepare. Because 6 years was a long time, and Emmy was waiting. I'm building it, Caleb whispered to the darkness, to his grandfather's ghost, to his sister, 60 miles away. I'm building it strong. And then he closed his eyes and let the warmth of the fire carry him towards sleep. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the metal walls, but the foundation held. It always would. Spring came slowly to the mountains. The snow retreated inch by inch, revealing brown earth and last year's dead leaves. The stream ran higher, swollen with meltwater, roaring over the stones where it had whispered before. The days grew longer, the light lingering later into the evening, and the birds returned, filling the forest with sounds that Caleb had almost forgotten existed. He had been on the land for 3 months now. The Quonset hut no longer looked like something abandoned. The rust was still there, would always be there, but beneath the decay was structure, purpose, life. He had framed interior walls, creating separate spaces where there had been only emptiness. A bedroom for himself, small but private. A larger room beside it, still unfinished, waiting. Emmy's room. He had measured it twice, made sure it would catch the morning light through the window he planned to install. The kitchen area had a proper counter, now built from planks he had salvaged from a collapsed barn 3 miles down the road. He had sanded them smooth over the course of 2 weeks, his hands cramped and aching every night, until the wood glowed with a warmth that seemed to come from inside. A real floor was taking shape. Not concrete, but wood. Salvaged oak, each board carefully fitted and nailed into place. It wasn't finished, but the sections that were done felt like home when he walked across them. The work never stopped. Every day brought a new task, a new problem to solve. But Caleb had discovered something in these months of labor. He was good at this. The knowledge surprised him. In the group home, he had been average. Quiet. Unmemorable. Just another kid marking time until the world pushed him out. But here, with tools in his hands and his grandfather's lessons echoing in his memory, he found a competence he hadn't known he possessed. His hands knew things. How to read the grain of wood. How to swing a hammer so the weight did the work. How to measure twice and cut once, the way Silas had taught him that summer long ago. A man is measured by what he builds. Caleb was starting to measure up. But the work on the hut was only part of his days. The other part was preparation. Because Warren Prescott hadn't given up. The developers hadn't gone away. They were circling, watching, waiting for weakness. And Caleb refused to give them any. The town library was a small brick building next to the post office, staffed by a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had been the librarian for 30 years and showed no signs of stopping. She had watched Caleb with suspicion the first few times he came in, this rough-looking young man who spent hours in the legal section, but gradually her wariness had softened into something like curiosity. He never explained what he was researching. She never asked. But she started leaving books on the table for him. Water law, property rights, contract negotiation, the kind of dense technical volumes that most people would never touch. Caleb devoured them. He learned about riparian rights, the complex web of law governing who could use water and how. He learned about easements and right-of-way, the legal pathways that developers use to access resources on other people's land. He learned about eminent domain, the government's power to seize private property, and more importantly, he learned about its limits. The documents his grandfather had left were his most valuable resource. The geological surveys, the water table measurements, the legal opinion from the specialist. Each one was a weapon carefully prepared and waiting to be used. But Caleb also knew that weapons only mattered if you knew how to wield them. So he practiced. He wrote out arguments in his cramped handwriting, rehearsing the points he might need to make. He studied the county code, looking for the specific provisions that Ridgeline might try to use against him. He found the flaws in their position and memorized them. At night, by the light of an oil lamp, he would sit with his grandfather's journal and read. The entries from Silas's years on the survey team were particularly valuable. Technical details about the aquifer, notes on the geological formations, observations about the politics of water rights in the region. They tried to bury it, Silas had written in one entry dated 32 years ago. The survey results, the water data. Someone high up decided it was better if nobody knew. But I kept copies. I always kept copies. Those copies were in Caleb's lockbox now, his inheritance, his ammunition. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late April. Caleb had walked to town for supplies and stopped at the post office to check the box Mr. Finch had helped him set up. Most days it was empty. Today there was an envelope, heavy paper, embossed letterhead. The return address was a law firm in Albany, the kind of firm with 4 names and a reputation for winning. He opened it standing in the post office lobby, the other patrons moving around him unnoticed. The letter was 3 pages long, dense with legal language. But the message was simple. Ridgeline Development Corporation was filing a formal petition with the county to condemn his property as a public health hazard. They were citing the lack of utilities, the deteriorating structure, and the potential environmental impact of an unregulated dwelling in a sensitive watershed area. They were also filing a separate motion to challenge his ownership of the water rights, claiming that the original deed had never properly conveyed subsurface resources. The deadline to respond was 30 days. Caleb read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. His hands were steady, his breathing was calm. They were making their move, just as his grandfather had predicted. Now it was his turn. Mr. Finch's office smelled the same as it had 3 months ago. Old paper, furniture polish, history. The lawyer listened as Caleb laid out the situation, spreading the documents across the mahogany desk. The petition, the motion, the surveys from his grandfather's lockbox, the legal opinion on water rights. Finch read everything twice, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he leaned over the papers. When he finally looked up, there was something new in his eyes. Respect. Your grandfather was a remarkable man. He planned for this. Yes, he did. Finch leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The petition to condemn is weak. You've been improving the property, not neglecting it. I can bring in the county inspector myself if needed, show them the work you've done. That motion will be dismissed. And the water rights challenge, that's more complicated. Finch pulled off his spectacles and polished them slowly. They're arguing that the original deed language from 1952 didn't explicitly convey subsurface mineral and water rights. It's a common tactic in these cases. Force the current owner into expensive litigation, make them spend more on lawyers than the property is worth. I can't afford lawyers. No. Finch smiled slightly, but you might not need them. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. Your grandfather anticipated this argument. That's why he commissioned the legal opinion 15 years ago. He paid a specialist to review the original deed language and compare it to case law. Finch tapped the document. According to this analysis, the deed language is clear. Subsurface rights were conveyed with the property. Their challenge has no merit. So why are they filing it to scare you? Finch set down his pen. to make you think this will drag on for years, to make $25,000 or $50,000 or whatever they offer next seem like the easier path. Caleb thought about Emmy, about the promise he had made, about the room he was building for her still unfinished, still waiting. I'm not scared. Finch studied him for a long moment. No, I don't suppose you are. The response was filed on a Thursday. Mr. Finch handled the legal paperwork, but Caleb was there for every meeting, every document, review, every strategy session. He asked questions, he took notes, he learned. The county inspector came out to the property and found what Caleb had known he would find. A young man working to improve an inherited property. New framing, new windows, a functioning heating system. Evidence of serious investment in a structure that had been abandoned for years. The petition to condemn was dismissed in 3 weeks. The water rights challenge took longer. Depositions, document requests, legal maneuvering that felt more like chess than combat. But Caleb had his grandfather's documents. And more importantly, he had the truth. The original deed was clear. The water rights had never been separated. The aquifer belonged to whoever owned the land. And that owner was Caleb Weston. The challenge was dismissed in June. Ridgeline Development had lost twice. Their legal tactics had failed. Their bluffs had been called. But Caleb knew they weren't finished. Men like Warren Prescott didn't lose gracefully. They regrouped. They found new angles. They came back harder. The next move would be different. It was. The letter arrived in July, not from a law firm this time, from Ridgeline Development directly. Prescott's signature was at the bottom. The language was formal, but the message was clear. They were requesting a meeting, in person, at Mr. Finch's office, to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. No lawyers from their side, just Prescott and a representative from the parent company. Caleb read the letter standing in the summer sunshine, the warm breeze carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. They wanted to negotiate. That meant they were getting desperate. The meeting was set for a Wednesday afternoon in late July. Caleb arrived early wearing the cleanest clothes he owned, work boots worn but polished, jeans without holes, a button-down shirt he had bought at the thrift store in town. He looked like what he was, a young man who worked with his hands, a young man who had something they wanted. Prescott arrived exactly on time, accompanied by a woman Caleb hadn't seen before. She was older than Prescott, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who made decisions that cost millions of dollars. Mr. Finch made introductions. The woman's name was Victoria Cross. She was the CEO of the parent company that owned Ridgeline Development. They sat across from each other in Finch's conference room, a heavy oak table between them like a battlefield. Prescott looked different than he had at their last meeting. The confidence was still there, but it was strained now. The easy smile had an edge of desperation. Victoria Cross did not smile at all. Mr. Weston, her voice was cool, precise. Thank you for meeting with us. Caleb nodded, said nothing. She studied him for a moment, her gaze assessing. I'll be direct. Our project has been delayed significantly due to the uncertainty surrounding your property. We've invested considerable resources in this development. We need access to a reliable water source to move forward. That's not my problem. No, she allowed a thin smile. But I'd like to make it your opportunity. She slid a document across the table. $250,000 for the property and all associated rights. A clean sale. You walk away with enough money to start a new life anywhere you want. Caleb didn't touch the document. He let it sit there between them. $250,000, more money than most people would see in a decade, more than enough to get Emmy out, to start over somewhere else, to leave all of this behind. He thought about his grandfather, about the 30 years of planning that had led to this moment. He thought about Emmy's hand pressed against the glass. He thought about the foundation he was building. No, Prescott leaned forward. Be reasonable, Mr. Weston. This is a life-changing offer. I don't want your money. Caleb kept his voice level. But I'm willing to negotiate. Victoria Cross's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you want? You need water. I have water. There's a way for both of us to get what we want without me giving up my land. He pulled out a document of his own. He had written it by hand, then had Mr. Finch review and type it properly. It was 4 pages long. Every word was deliberate. I'm proposing a lease agreement, Caleb said. Not a sale. You get access to the water you need. I keep my land. They read the document. He watched their faces. The terms were specific. A 99-year lease on water extraction rights, with Caleb retaining ownership of the land and the aquifer itself. An annual payment based on the volume of water extracted, and a list of requirements. Ridgeline would pay for the drilling and installation of a commercial-grade well and pump system. They would cover all costs of connecting the property to the electrical grid. They would pay for the construction of a proper road accessing the property. And there was one more requirement, a community water trust, Caleb said, funded by Ridgeline, administered by a local board. Residents of this county get priority access to water at reduced rates, in perpetuity. Prescott's face had gone red. This is extortion. No, this is negotiation. Caleb met his gaze steadily. I have something you need. You have resources I need. We can make a deal, or we can keep fighting in court. Your choice. Victoria Cross was still reading the document. Her expression had shifted from skepticism to something harder to identify. You wrote this yourself with help. Mr. Finch and I worked on the language, but the terms are mine. She set the document down and looked at him. Really looked the way his grandfather used to look at a piece of wood before deciding what to make of it. How old are you, mister? You. Weston, 18. She was quiet for a long moment. You understand that this agreement would make you a very unusual kind of landowner. You'd have ongoing obligations, legal responsibilities. You'd be tied to this property for the rest of your life, I understand. And you're prepared for that, Caleb thought about Emmy, about the room waiting for her, about the foundation he had built with his own hands. This is my home. Victoria Cross nodded slowly. Then she picked up a pen. We'll need to review this with our legal team, make some adjustments to the language, but the framework is acceptable. Prescott's head snapped toward her. Victoria, this is the deal, Warren. She didn't look at him. We've wasted enough time and money fighting a battle we were never going to win. It's time to move forward. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not triumph, something quieter. The feeling of a door opening onto a future he had barely dared to imagine. The final agreement was signed 6 weeks later. The lawyers had made their adjustments. The language had been refined. But the core terms remained exactly as Caleb had proposed. Ridgeline got their water, Caleb kept his land, and the community of Millbrook got something they hadn't had before, a voice in how their resources were used. The drilling began in September. Caleb watched from his porch as the heavy equipment rolled down the new gravel road, the road he had negotiated for the road that connected his property to the outside world. Electricity followed. Real power, not the generator he had been using. He ran wires through the walls he had framed, installed switches and outlets, worked by the light of real bulbs for the first time since arriving. The money started coming too. Monthly payments into an account Mr. Finch had helped him set up. Not a fortune, but steady, reliable, enough to live on, enough to save, enough to prepare for what came next. The letter to the family court was sent in October. Caleb had written it himself, then had Mr. Finch review it for legal language. It was a petition for guardianship, for Emmy. The response came in November. A hearing date, January 15th. Caleb read the letter standing on his porch, the first snow of winter dusting the trees around him. The Quonset hut at his back was warm and solid smoke curling from the stovepipe into the gray sky. 4 months. He had 4 months to prepare. He went back inside and got to work. The room had to be perfect. Caleb spent December finishing Emmy's space. The window he had promised installed to catch the morning light. The walls painted a soft yellow, the color of the dress she had worn in that photograph from the county fair. A bed frame he built himself, the joints tight and solid, the wood sanded smooth. He made a bookshelf, a small desk, a chair that was just the right height for a 12-year-old girl. Every nail, every board, every careful measurement was an act of hope. At night, he would sit in the finished room and imagine her there, reading, sleeping, being safe, being home. The hearing was set for 10 in the morning. Caleb arrived at the courthouse an hour early, wearing a suit he had bought at a second-hand store in Albany. It didn't fit perfectly, but it was clean and pressed and respectable. He had brought a folder full of documents, the deed to his property, bank statements showing steady income, letters from Mr. Finch, from Gus Brewer, from Mrs. Patterson at the library, A community vouching for a young man they had watched work and struggle and build. The courtroom was smaller than he had expected. The judge was a woman in her 60s, gray-haired and serious with reading glasses perched on her nose. Emmy was there, sitting at a table with her caseworker, a woman named Mrs. Lawson, who looked like she had seen too many of these cases and had stopped expecting happy endings. Emmy looked older than he remembered. Taller, her hair was longer, but her eyes were the same, wide and dark and full of something that might have been fear or might have been hope. She saw him and her whole face changed. He had to look away or he wouldn't be able to speak. The hearing took 2 hours. Mrs. Lawson presented her concerns. Caleb was young, inexperienced. His living situation was unconventional. There were questions about his ability to provide stable care for a child. Caleb answered each point calmly. He presented his documents. He explained his situation. He described the home he had built. And when the lawyers and caseworkers had finished speaking, the judge looked at him over her glasses. Mr. Weston, you aged out of the foster system less than a year ago. You were homeless, without resources, without support. She paused. And now you're asking this court to grant you guardianship of your sister. Yes, Your Honor. Worried. The question was simple. The answer was everything. Because she's my family. Caleb's voice was steady, but something was cracking behind it. Because I made her a promise. Because I spent 10 months building a home for her with my own hands. He paused. Because I know what it's like to have nobody, and she deserves better than that. The courtroom was silent. The judge studied him for a long moment. I've reviewed your file, Mr. Weston. I've read the letters from your community. I've seen the documentation of your property, your income, your living situation. She paused. I've also read the original caseworker notes from when you and your sister entered the system 8 years ago. She set down the file. You were 10 years old. Your sister was 4. And according to these notes, you told the intake officer that you would take care of her, that you wouldn't let anything happen to her. She looked at him over her glasses. Do you remember saying that Caleb swallowed? Yes, Your Honor. The notes also say that you kept that promise. Through every placement, through every transition. You looked out for her. She nodded slowly. That matters to this court. She was quiet for a moment. This is an unusual case. You're young. Your circumstances are unconventional. There are legitimate concerns about your ability to provide long-term care. She paused. But I've also seen the evidence of what you've accomplished in the past year. The home you've built, the support you've gathered, the future you're working toward. She picked up her pen. The petition for guardianship is granted. She signed the document. Emmy Weston will be released to your custody effective immediately. Caleb didn't hear the rest. The words faded into a roar in his ears, a sound like wind through trees, like water over stones, like his own heart finally beating free. He turned and looked at Emmy. She was already out of her seat, already running toward him. She hit him like a small hurricane, her arms wrapping around him, her face pressed against his chest. He held her tight, tighter than he had ever held anything. I told you, she whispered. I told you I'd wait, I know. His voice was rough. I know you did. Around them, the courtroom continued its business. Papers shuffled, doors opened and closed. Life went on. But for Caleb and Emmy, the world had stopped. They had found each other again. They were going home. The drive took 3 hours. Caleb had borrowed Gus Brewer's truck for the day. It was old and loud and smelled like motor oil, but it ran strong and the heater worked. Emmy sat in the passenger seat, her small bag of belongings in her lap. She didn't have much. Nobody in the system ever did. But she had him now, and he had her. They didn't talk much during the drive. There would be time for talking later. For now, it was enough to be together. To watch the city fall away behind them. To see the hills rise up ahead, the trees pressing close on either side of the winding road. The turn onto the gravel road made Emmy sit up straighter. The road was new. Caleb had helped build it, hauling gravel and grading the surface until it was smooth and solid. And then the trees opened up and the Quonset hut appeared. Emmy's breath caught. It wasn't the rusted wreck that Caleb had found 10 months ago. The structure was the same, the curved metal roof still patched and imperfect. But there were windows now, real windows with real glass. A proper door with a brass handle. A porch he had built from salvaged lumber, wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table. Smoke curled from the chimney. The lights were on inside. Caleb pulled the truck to a stop and killed the engine. This is it. This is it. Emmy was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her door and stepped out into the cold January air. Caleb followed her out, watched her walk toward the building, watched her climb the 3 steps to the porch and put her hand on the railing he had sanded smooth. She turned back to look at him. You built this, most of it. He climbed the steps to stand beside her. Grandpa Silas started it. I just finished what he began. Emmy looked at the door, at the windows, at the solid walls and the warm light spilling through the glass. Can I see inside? Caleb opened the door. The interior was warm, the wood stove crackling gently in the corner. The salvaged oak floor gleamed in the lamplight. The kitchen counter he had built stretched along one wall, clean and solid and real. And at the far end of the main room, a door stood open. Emmy walked towards it slowly. Caleb followed. She stepped through the doorway and stopped. The room was small but perfect. Yellow walls, the color of sunshine. A window facing east where the morning light would come. A bed with a quilt their grandmother had made recovered from storage at Mr. Finch's office. A bookshelf, a desk, a chair, all of it waiting, all of it ready. This is for me. Her voice was barely a whisper. I built it for you. Emmy turned around. Her eyes were bright with tears she was trying not to shed. You really did it. Her voice cracked. You really came back for me. Caleb knelt down so they were eye to eye. I promised, didn't I? She threw her arms around his neck and held on tight. They stayed like that for a long time. The fire crackling, the wind murmuring outside, the foundation solid beneath them. Home at last. That night they sat on the porch together, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars emerge one by one in the clear winter sky. The cold was sharp but clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. In the distance, an owl called. Another answered. Caleb Emmy's voice was soft. Yeah, tell me about Grandpa Silas. Caleb was quiet for a moment, gathering memories. He was a builder. Like me, I guess. Or like I'm learning to be. He worked with his hands his whole life. Stone walls, wooden cabinets, houses that would last 100 years. He paused. He taught me things. When I was young, how to hold a hammer, how to read the grain of wood, how to build something that would stand. Do you remember him a little? Caleb smiled. He smelled like sawdust and pipe tobacco. He didn't talk much, but when he did, he meant every word. And he had this saying he used to tell me all the time. What was it? A man is measured by what he builds, not by what he says. Emmy was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. He'd be proud of you. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. A knot he hadn't known was there finally coming undone. I hope so. They sat in silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. The bus station, the $5 deed, the rusted hut, and the hidden money and the letters from a man who had been planning for this moment for 30 years. He thought about Prescott and Victoria Cross and the battle that had seemed so impossible until he won it. He thought about the foundation. Not just the concrete and stone beneath the building, but the other kind. The kind you build with patience and planning and love. His grandfather had laid the first stones, had prepared the way, had left everything Caleb needed to build something lasting. And now it was Caleb's turn. His turn to add to the foundation. His turn to build something worth passing on. The wind picked up, rattling the metal walls, but inside the fire held steady. The warmth held. The foundation held. Emmy's breathing had slowed. She was asleep against his shoulder, her small body relaxed and trusting. Caleb looked up at the stars one more time. Thank you, he whispered. To his grandfather. To the land. To whatever force in the universe had brought him to this moment. Then he gathered his sister in his arms and carried her inside. The Quonset hut was warm and quiet. The fire crackled low. The wooden floor he had built with his own hands creaked softly under his feet. He laid Emmy in her bed, tucked the quilt around her shoulders, and stood watching her for a moment. She was home. Really home. For the first time since their parents died. And so was he. Caleb walked to the window and looked out at the night. The stars, the trees, the land that was his now. The future spreading out ahead like an unwritten story. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Build something good. I will, Caleb promised. I will. He turned away from the window and went to sit by the fire. The heat soaked into his bones. The silence wrapped around him like a blanket. Outside, the wind died down. The trees went still. The night held its breath. And in a rusted metal hut on a piece of land that had cost $5, a young man and his sister slept safely for the first time in years. The foundation held them both. It always would.